Well, I want to start this series we looked at a couple of weeks ago. On the night of his arrest, immediately after the Last Supper, Jesus talked about the importance of producing fruit. And this is what he said. This is John 15, 1-8. He said, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." And so, guys, God's desire for us individually and collectively is that we bear fruit. In other words, God has given us work to do, and he's very, very concerned that work get done. So you aren't just here on earth to take up space or to suck air. God has created you and called you to himself to bear fruit. You think about the very first commandment to humanity was be fruitful and multiply. God has created us to produce fruit. Jesus told a story one time to drive home the importance of this. He said there were 3 servants, and they were each given money by their master. 2 of the servants invested the money, and they produced an increase, while the third, the one that Jesus called wicked and lazy, just sat on the money and did nothing with it. When the master returned, he called all 3 to account for their management. The 2 that produced a return were rewarded for their work, while the one that produced no increase was punished. And Jesus' point was simple. God expects us to produce fruit, to make something out of what we're given. Now, these words of Jesus in John 15 give the image of this vineyard. It's an image that his disciples would have been very familiar with. It's a picture of growth and fruitfulness. And Jesus is like, envision a vineyard that never produces grapes. It's like, that's just a waste of land. It's just a waste of space. And on the night of his words about the vineyard, his death is imminent. I mean, this is right after the Last Supper. This is an emotional moment. And for 3 years with these guys, he's been walking with them. He's been teaching them. He's been encouraging them. He's been challenging them. He's been modeling for them what kingdom life looks like. And knowing that this will be his last night with them, he's now conferring upon them the kingdom. And he says to them, you guys are the vineyard. You are God's vineyard, and so go produce fruit. Now, in Jesus' day, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but in Jesus' day, a vineyard would be planted, but it wouldn't be allowed to produce grapes for 3 years, until the 3rd year. The vines would need to grow and get strong enough to be able to bear the weight of the fruit. Now, for Jesus, he's been walking with these guys. He's been teaching them. He's been training them. He's been developing them. He's been preparing them for 3 years. And mostly to this point, it's just been sit around and watch. Just grow, just get stronger, just see what's going on. But here he says, he comes to the end of his time with them. He goes, guys, it is time to go. It's time to do. It's time for you now to produce fruit. And he says, by this, my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. And so I want to start this series by reminding us of some really foundational things. Things that if you're somebody who's a follower of Jesus, you know this stuff. This is not brand new. But I believe that we probably need to be reminded a whole lot more than we need to be instructed, because we forget what we already know. And these are things that we can so easily lose sight of, things that can kind of become an afterthought for us, okay, that just flow right out of these words of Jesus. And the first one is this: producing fruit is how we live a meaningful life. Like, to try to live a meaningful life without producing fruit is just silly. There's something in the human heart that yearns to be fruitful. We draw meaning from producing something of value. Like for musicians, right? It's new creative music. For artists, it's captivating art. Okay, art that communicates something. For mechanics, it's a smooth running engine. Right, Ann? Right, Ann? Yeah. She's married to Bruce. Man, it is a smooth running engine. For teachers, it's watching light bulbs come on in their students. If you're a teacher, you know. Young people learning and loving to learn, it's for coaches, it's a team playing to its potential. For managers, it's departments running efficiently. It's employees that are loving coming to work. For engineers, it's designing something better. For dancers, it's perfecting the beauty of motion. For craftsmen, it's building something with a high level of detail. And we know that there's real joy. There's genuine joy that comes with doing good work, with producing something of value. And I believe that this is part of God's image that's in us. Because he's a God that creates. He's a God that does amazing work. And his children are then wired to do the same. And this is why it makes sense that retirement turns out to be really painful for a lot of people. I mean, it's simply like people will work their entire lives and they're dreaming, right? They're dreaming of retirement. And then they retire and it's like, whoa, what is this? What now? And they can slip right into a depression because they can't seem to find meaning in life. There's nothing to do to be productive. Like it turns out that no amount of golf or fishing can take the place of being fruitful. It turns out that fruitfulness and meaning are inextricably linked. You can't really have one without the other. You think about the way vacations often work. I mean, like, people dream, right? It's like retirement, but they dream and wait for the vacation, and then it happens, and by the end, they're going stir crazy. Why? Because as humans, we are wired to produce fruit. Many of you know, like Jen and I went to Cabo last year, and we had this like very repetitive rhythm to our days there. We had this condo that was overlooking the beach and the ocean. It's just gorgeous. And so we would get up and we'd have breakfast and look out the window. And then when that had settled a little bit, we'd go down to the beach and we'd swim and we'd snorkel. And then we'd sit on the warm beach and we'd read together. Okay, we were reading this book that we were liking, and we'd talk about what we were reading, and then we would go out and we'd swim and we'd snorkel some more. And then when our spot on the beach got shady, we just packed it up and went in. We went back to the condo and we showered and maybe ate a little bit and then read some more. And then at night we would, and this is the same rhythm every day, we would go for about a 10-mile walk. So we'd head, it was about 5 miles from our condo into like downtown Cabo. And so we would walk in there and we would find some super cheap tacos and like a Corona. And we kind of wander around town and then 5 miles back to our little condo. And we're walking and we're talking the whole way. Now, for some of you, that doesn't sound like a vacation. What's the matter with you guys? Okay, but for us, we were like, this is it, man. This is our jam. Like, tons of exercise, tons of sun, tons of reading, thinking, talking, more sun, more talking, okay, more walking, more tacos, more talking. And as we're walking and talking and reading and processing all this stuff, we're talking about the stuff in our life that matters to us. We're talking about our kids. We're talking about watching them grow up. We're talking about the people they're becoming. And we're talking about this church, and we're like, where is God leading us? What does God want for us? And we're just processing all of this stuff. And the ideas for parenting and for our church, the vision's just like flowing and flowing. And I'll tell you what, like by the end of that thing, we're doing this every day. I actually couldn't wait to get back. I was like, man, I got to get back to doing something. Like, I can't sit on a beach anymore. Because as beautiful as Cabo was, as incredible as our time was there, a week with no meaningful work, a week with no fruitfulness was causing both of us to go a little stir crazy. Like, I needed to see my kids. I needed to parent them. I needed to get back into doing some meaningful ministry. And it turned out that for us, no amount of walking, snorkeling, or eating tacos could actually take the place of being fruitful. And I think that many of you have had this experience one way or another. We are wired to be fruitful. Something in us dies if we cease producing fruit for too long. So I just want you to stop and think. What is the work that God is giving you to do right now? What is the work that God is laying before you and saying, this is what I want you to get done? Is it raising toddlers? Is it developing software? Is it building airplanes? Is it educating kids? Like, what kind of work does God have for you right now? Is it caring for a relative? Is it building a relationship with a neighbor? Is it loving your spouse? Like, truly loving your spouse? Like, doing everything humanly possible to bring out the best in that other person? Because, man, that's important work. Is it supporting your kids as they're raising their kids? Like, how has God uniquely gifted you and positioned you? Because if you want to feel alive, if you want to find meaning, then do this. Figure out what work it is that God is giving you, and then you go and you do that with everything you've got. When you do what God asks, Jesus empowers you. It's like he's the vine and you're the branch. When we first started at Brookview many years ago, I had a pastor friend that was quite a bit older than me, and he called me one day and asked me for a favor. He asked if Jen and I would do premarital counseling for his son who was engaged. And my friend was going to, he was going to do the wedding. He was the dad, he's going to do the wedding. But he, for obvious reasons, didn't want to do the counseling with them. I just am envisioning this older guy with his future daughter-in-law talking about sexuality. So he called and said, hey, could you do the counseling? He said, actually, I think you guys would connect really well. You're about the same age as them. And so his son and his fiance, at that time, they weren't walking with Jesus. And that was a big concern for him. It was another reason why he sort of handed them to us. Now, with him being a pastor, okay, his son grew up in the church, but he hadn't been walking with Jesus for years. And his son's fiance had like zero church background whatsoever, just nothing. She was very kind. She was a very competent young lady, and she was just a beautiful girl. And to be honest, I was a little bit surprised for them, just based on where they were at in their life, that they agreed to counseling. But they did. And so Jen and I met with them several times. And after a few meetings, we didn't know what this was going to be like. But after a few meetings, this was going like surprisingly well. They were completely opening up. It was the coolest thing because they were taking their future marriage very seriously, and they were taking their time with us in preparing for it very seriously. And I don't remember how it came up exactly, but during our last meeting with them, the bride-to-be ventured out and asked a spiritual question. And you could tell that she was like nervous about it. But she asked it anyway. And so Jen and I talked with her through that. And I don't remember exactly what she asked, but that discussion led to a bunch of other spiritual questions. And so here we are, we're having this really in-depth, lengthy spiritual discussion. And she was very interested in all of this stuff. And as we talked, the more interested she seemed to get. And she just kept asking questions. And we just kept explaining stuff to her as well as we can. And then she just stopped right in the middle of everything we're doing. And she said, okay. And she kind of dropped a little bit of a bomb. We were like, whoa. She said, so why did Jesus go to the cross? Now, sometimes pastors have like a whole spiel memorized. for a question like that? I didn't. I don't. Because I'm not big on spiels. But that's a big question. You're sitting there with someone who's not a believer, not a follower of Jesus, and they go, why did Jesus? So, and I'm thinking about that going, there are thousands of ways to try to answer that question right now in this moment. And so the question just sort of lingered. She asked it, and we were just like, and so Jen looked at me, and I looked at her, and she looked back at me, and she gave me the, this one's on you, Pastor, look. And so I was like, okay, and I just sort of dove in. Now, I don't really remember what I said. I'm pretty sure it had something to do with like sin and grace. It definitely had something to do with our guilt being washed away. And you could see that was a big, as we had talked with them, that was a big issue in her life. And so I really don't remember exactly how that all went. It was kind of a blur. But what I do remember is that the more that I talked, the more intense her face got. Like she was leaning forward and her eyes started to water, and then she was like grinning at the same time, and she's just nodding profusely. And I remember this feeling as I was talking, this sense that like, whoa, I have never explained anything this well in my life. Like I was hearing myself say things, and I was like, whoa, dude, that was really good. And to be honest, it was like I wasn't talking at all. Like there were just words sort of pouring out of me. And Jen was smiling and nodding. And when I was done, my friend's son's fiance said, she was like, that is the most amazing thing. She said, I'm literally shaking right now. I don't even know how to describe for you what it is that I'm feeling. She said, I've had all this guilt, and it's been wrecking me for years. And she was like, it's all gone. Like, I can just feel it, like it's lifted. And she was like, I don't know if I can do it this fast, if I'm supposed to do it this fast, but I want to follow Jesus. And I know that this is what I need. I know that this is what I've been waiting for, like my whole life. And so she looked at her husband and she said, what do I do? You know, pastor's kid. And he's like, well, I suppose you should like say a prayer. And she was like, okay. And so Jen and I kind of led her through a simple little prayer, and she gave her life to Jesus. And at the end of the night, we all hugged, and it wasn't like the obligatory, like, okay, we should hug, or maybe we should shake hands, or, I don't know. This was a hug like we had just gone through war together. It was one of those kind of deals. And I can't really explain to you what that whole experience was like, because I can't really do it justice, but the presence of God was so thick in that room. And I'll tell you, in that moment, I felt like, man, this is what I was born to do. Now, they got married, and just a few weeks later, and they ended up moving to Florida right after that, which was their plan. And so it kind of felt like that would be the end of the story for us, because they had said, we'd really like to go to your church, but we're moving. We're like, yeah, that's kind of a bummer. And we were worried because she'd made this decision. But every year, they send out a Christmas card. And she always writes a little one-page letter. She just sort of describes what's going on. And that picture, as the years have gone by, have included more and more kids, beautiful little kids. And there's that letter. And what's the most amazing thing to us is that every year in that letter, you see their faith becoming more and more front and center to their life. So they moved to Florida. They got involved in this little church, and she's leading ministries, and she's going on mission trips, and she's leading small groups, and she's organizing all this stuff. She's such a competent person, and now that's all surrendered to Jesus, and she has become a leader in this little community. And in her writing, you can see the thread of Jesus just woven all through their life. And so every December we get these Christmas cards and we read the letter. And Jen and I just, we just smile. And we're like, man, that was the most amazing time that we had for them. And guys, that was, for me, that was work that God gave me to do and gave Jen to do. Work that he gave us to do together, and we did it. And he blessed it, and he made it fruitful. I remember this, I called his dad, later on to say, you're not going to believe what happened. And his dad, was really nervous about this whole thing. His dad was like, yeah. I'm like, what? Come on, dude. She came to Jesus. It was the most amazing thing. He's like, yeah, I know. He's like, we've been praying every time you guys meet. We knew it was going to happen. All right. This was just one of those moments where I felt God empowering me. And it was a time when I was doing what I was born to do. And this is the question that I want to ask you is, what were you born to do? What is it that God is giving to you that would please him and would please you? Because if you listen to him and you go and you do that, he has this mysterious way of blessing it and making it abundantly fruitful. And that leads me to a second foundational thing that we take from Jesus' words. Producing fruit, Jesus said, is contingent upon abiding. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. And we hear that and go, oh, wait a minute, I can do nothing? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't, accomplish anything without abiding. You could hit a good golf shot. You could build a table. You could learn how to knit a sweater. Guys, you don't even need to be a Christian to do that kind of stuff. What Jesus is talking about when he says producing fruit here, he's talking about something else. He's talking about hearing God. He's talking about listening to the Spirit of God in you. He's talking about God using you to bring his kingdom. He's talking about the kingdom coming through you, descending from heaven to earth through you. He's talking about having the right words for someone. He's talking about your life being a light to the world that changes people, that impacts people. He's talking about knowing where to be and what to do and how to do it. He's talking about sensing God moving you and then responding. He's talking about God taking your natural talents that you've had your whole life and then infusing them with spiritual power to do something that will last for eternity. And this is about kingdom fruit. It's about fruit that will last forever. And I know most of you know Tony Ellersick, and just as I was thinking through this, he came to mind for me because his story is just awesome. For those of you that don't know, or for those of you that do even, Tony was a stereotypical jock, partier, punk in high school. And then he encountered Jesus through Young Life. And he was just swept off his feet. He had, it wasn't this slow, it was a dramatic conversion. So he quit smoking pot, and he quit drinking all the time, and he quit sleeping around. But more than just the behaviors, what happened is his heart changed. His values changed. He understood what he didn't understand before. He cared about what he didn't care about before. And if you know Tony, there was this quiet strength to him. It still is. God just made him into a light. And the cool thing is, it's not some ultra-religious, holier than thou kind of thing. If you know Tony, he's the polar opposite of that. Just this humble, down-to-earth, sincere, kind guy. But that quiet strength that he has is real. And he has convictions, and he lives by them. Okay? And they're obvious. Now, because of who he is, Tony has had just this massive influence on a whole bunch of people. And I think that his influence is way broader and way deeper than he has any idea. But one of the people that has been deeply impacted by him is his little brother, Casey. And if you think about where Casey is right now, it is amazing. I mean, Casey has kind of a similar story. I mean, just from like the jock partier guy in high school to then this, I think I want to follow Jesus, to I think I might want to help other people follow Jesus. I think I will help lead Young Life, to, hey, I'm going to give a talk at Young Life for like 6 minutes. What in the world am I going to say for 6 minutes? And all along the way in this whole thing, Tony's in the background, right? He's his biggest cheerleader. Just, dude, you can do this. Like, dude, that talk was awesome. You killed it. And before you know it, Casey's invited to speak at Brookview, to give his testimony during one of my messages, to share with everyone about his battle with pornography. That's quite an intro. Talk with everyone about how God was helping him through it, the way he needed grace and the way he needed accountability. And it was this powerful thing. And there's Tony. Dude, that was so good. You're such a good speaker. And Tony can encourage people like nobody I've ever met. And for me, he's such a gift. Because if I need to feel better about myself, I'm like, Tony, you want to hang out? I need someone to tell me how awesome I am. But it's funny with Tony because at the same time, he has this amazing ability to call people out. And Casey got his share of that over the years too. Tony just pulling him aside and going, dude, what are you doing? And the crazy thing is, over the years with Casey, Tony had this amazing knack for knowing what to say, like how to say it, when to say it. It's like the words were right there in him. Like he's a branch connected to a vine. And when you look at Tony's life, there's just fruit everywhere. Like he's affected so many people in so many ways, and especially Casey. And for those of you that, some of you are like, who are these people? For those of you that don't know Casey, he became my go-to fill-in guy for preaching. He's just this young punk with this unbelievable gift of communicating and a heart for God. And after filling in for me for almost 2 years around here, after preaching, guys, he preached 16 sermons here before he left. Casey felt compelled by God to go to Bible school and to try to go all the way with this thing, to see where God might be leading him in his life. And so he picked up and he moved to Australia in January. And I have to tell you guys, he's doing so good. Last I heard, he's dating this Jesus-loving Canadian girl. And so every once in a while I think about that, and I have visions of them married with all these Can-American kids. This family that's fluent in 3 languages, American, Canadian, and Australian, This Can-American family just planted somewhere in the world serving Jesus. And I don't even know if they're still dating. Does anybody know if they're still dating? I don't even know if they're still dating, but talked to Casey a while back about school and just where he's living, and his mind is just being blown with all the stuff that he's learning over there. He's so excited about it. Tony came over, and they were coming to life group. Rebecca and Tony were coming to our life group, and Tony was on the phone with Casey. And Casey had just been on a rant for an hour about how all this amazing stuff was amazing. And God bless Tony. His eyes were glossed over. He's and he just handed me the phone. So he wasn't being led by the Spirit in that moment. But Casey just went on and on about the stuff that he's excited about and stuff that's just setting his heart on fire. And you talk about a remarkable change in the trajectory of a life. God just got a hold of him and is taking him on this wild ride. But along the way, behind the scenes of all of that, is this brother. And you want to talk about God producing fruit. Because who knows what Casey's going to do in his life and the trickle-down effect of all this stuff. And here's the thing. It's not just about what God does through us, all the stuff we accomplish. It starts and it's all built on what God is doing in us. Paul was writing to the Galatians about life with Christ and how beautiful it is. And he contrasts a life of abiding with what he calls the life of the flesh. Like life lived apart from Jesus, apart from the Spirit of God. And listen to what he says. This is Galatians chapter 5, 16 to 21. He says, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under law. Now the works of the flesh are evident." He just goes on a rant. "Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these." But then he says, when life is connected to the vine, when we're filled with the Holy Spirit, when we're led by him, when we are abiding in Jesus, there's all this fruit then that comes pouring out of us. So he goes on, he says, but in contrast to all that stuff that comes from the flesh, he says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And see, this is the fruit in us that enables us to impact our world, to do something that will actually matter. And I think we can get really hung up on doing something big with our life. Like, what's the big thing God has for me? And we just get paralyzed. I don't know what that might be, so I'm just going to sit around, We get all stressed out about what does God want me to do? What's the right work for me to do? But here's I'll tell you what I've seen. If you just focus on connecting with Jesus, what will happen is he'll help you become something new. And when you become something new, what happens is everywhere you go, there will be a wake of fruit behind you. I don't think that for Tony, he just sat around every day and said, God, what fruit can I bear for you today? And God said, Tony, you've got to get Casey to Hillsong. And Tony said, aye, God, here we go. That's not how it went. He just focused on Jesus. He just sincerely focused on Jesus. And his impact on Casey was just a byproduct. And this is how it works. This is how it works. So here's my question for you. If you're sitting here going, I don't know what God has for me. I don't know what I'm supposed to go do. I just want to say, don't worry about that. Focus on abiding. And that leads me to my last thought for today, and it's this. Producing fruit requires pruning. Now, we touched on this a few weeks ago as well. But into all this discussion about abiding and producing fruit, right smack in the center of it, Jesus makes this reference to pruning. Jesus says that the vine dresser, God, who watches over the vineyard, he comes to the branches that are abiding in the vine, and he prunes those branches, Jesus says, making them more fruitful. And I want to talk about this again because this image of pruning is huge. It's built on the first century process of growing grapes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the days of Jesus, a vine would be cultivated and then planted, and then it would be left to grow for 3 years before it was allowed to bear any fruit. They would just keep cutting it back, not allow the fruit to come. For those first 3 years, every time it tried to bring forth grapes, they just cut it back. But then after the third year, the grapes would be allowed to just grow on their own, because by then, the branches were strong enough to support the weight of the grapes without breaking and destroying the vines. And then after the harvest, the branches would then be pruned back for a time of nourishment, time of rest, before the fruit growing season would begin again. Now, here's the deal. God calls all of us to bear fruit. He calls all of us to bear fruit. He cares very, very much about that. But to do that well over time, we all need periods of pruning, periods to rest and get strengthened, periods where work ceases, where productivity stops, where the goal isn't to produce fruit. It's just to abide, to rest and let the vine pour strength into us. Now, as many of you know, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, I believe that these rest periods have to be built into the rhythms of life. And certainly that's what God teaches us. I mean, one of the 10 commandments is to take a day off every week, to cease striving to be productive and to simply rest and abide. Take a Sabbath. And I believe God's intention for us is to have a work-rest rhythm at every level, okay? So we would have one daily. We would have one weekly. We would have one monthly. We would have one seasonally. Okay, in other words, to live a life of maximum fruitfulness, we have to have regular times of pruning where we're resting and we're abiding. And when I look at our culture, I look at the Christians in our culture, I go, man, we're dying. We're dying because we don't do this very well. We don't. We take time off work. We go places. We play hard. I mean, really, in many ways, we have way more time off than the generations that have come before us. But we're exhausted. We're not being energized. We're not abiding. And so I want us to spend some time on this. Because we're heading into this season where many of us are taking more time off than we normally do, right? It's summertime, we're camping, we're going places. But just because we're taking time off work, just because we're going on a vacation, does that mean that we're abiding? And I would say it doesn't. And I think for believers, we're having a hard time figuring out how to rest and abide. We can cease work, but learning to do this with Jesus is a whole nother thing. And so, Jen and I have actually spent the last 10 months or so really wrestling with what this means and what does this look like in our life. And I don't think there's a pat formula for this at all. But I think that it's something that we need to figure out as individuals. I think it's something that we need to figure out as a community. And so we're launching into this series this morning, and we're going to get a lot deeper with this. Today's kind of like the introduction. If you go, well, there's nothing practical. I know. Today's the introduction. Next week, we're going to get intensely practical with this. And I want to say, if you can't be here next week, these things are online. Okay, I'm going to be awesome. It's going to be good. And what I want to do is to start sharing with you guys what Jen and I are learning and give you some tools that you can use to get in the habit and the practice of abiding, because it changes lives. Jesus tells us, like, this really, really matters. And so we're gonna hit that hard next week. For this morning, I just want you to be asking yourself, okay, what is the work God has me to do? Are you giving it everything you've got? And is it possible that God wants to infuse you with supernatural power to do things that would actually blow your mind? That's the kind of life that disciples apparently are supposed to be living. If we do that together, oh my goodness.